Hello and welcome. This is our special edition, and in this edition, we are going to discuss United Nations unfair decision on permanent representation of African nations in the Security Council with veto power. And I'm Omomo Ibe. My guest today is Just Omomo Ibe from Nigeria, and Just Omomo Ibe is the president of the Association of African Startups, a Pan-African organization with a membership presence in almost all African countries, 55 countries. And welcome, Just Ibe, to my program.
Thank you very much, Aluma. Thank you for having me, and thank you for indeed steering this very important conversation around us as Africans.
Thank you. Welcome once again, and let us start our discussion. And as you know, recently the United Nations Security Council, decide unfair decision. And could you explain the significance of permanent representation in the United Nations Security Council for African nations?
Thank you very much. For the longest time, the United Nations, of course, with its organ, United Nations Security, have consistently pioneered what you may call global change security across all the countries in the world. And yes, they probably have done a great job, but now it has come to a time where us as African must be globally represented in that decision-making room so that we can pioneer the cause of change for ourselves. So if the United Nations security is trying to protect or create regional security systems within the continent, there's no better person to decide how truly we can achieve this for us, except if Africans are permanently represented there. Then those decisions can truly favor Africans. If we truly run a multilateral system as touching what the United Nations represents, then it's a no-brainer that at this point, we shouldn't even be asking for representation. It's what should be, right? And that is because we now live in an era where there's a new crop of African that is emerging. These Africans want answers. These Africans want to see a fairer way of governance as touching every singular tool or organ that the United Nations represent. And if at this point, us demanding for a permanent seat with the exact veto power that all the other 5 countries have, it's not too much to ask, because now more than ever, we need to be a part of those who make the decisions of how stable our regions are and of how peaceful indeed we enjoy the interactions between us as a people.
And as you know, even though the colonialism time is ended, still we are in the neocolonialism. Many scholars, writers, and activists, people who are highly concerned about the continent, like you, are usually explaining about this issue of neocolonialism. And how do you believe the legacy of neocolonialism continues to affect Africa's representation in international institutions right this time?
Thank you. Thank you very much. If you look at how the United Nations was created from the first place, I cannot separate the work that they do as an outshoot of what happened in Berlin, its Berlin Conference. So if the United Nations was developed to create peace and stability, security across all the nations of the world, you have to recognize that Africa was seen through the lens of what happened at Berlin. What this means is that Africa had been divided by these superpowers, and as such, we were in a way under the reign of these different countries. So it made sense that they continued to keep us under them in terms of representation, even at the UNSC. And so at this point, more than ever, it's important that what colonialism has done for us as Africans is it has perpetually created underrepresentation. It has created limited economic and political influence for us as Africans as touching those decision-making tables. And it has created a room for inequitable global decision-making process, even with the United Nations security. And that is why us as Africans have gotten to a point where we say, yes, we know that we have a legacy of colonialism and eventual neocolonialism, but if we are truly going to build the Africa that we see, then it's important that all the effects of colonialism and neocolonialism that has kept Africa outside the rooms where the decision has been made, it's time for us to begin to change those narratives, because now more than ever, we no longer want to be decided for how stability should be created, how issues such as climate change, climate justice should be decided within the continent. It is time for us to get out of the reign of these colonial powers and demand equal seats at the table with the same kind of veto power that the power of the 5 other countries have.
And the other point is, Ibe, the issue of impact, these decisions impact, and in what ways this exclusion of the African nations from the meaningful participation or representation in the United Nations Security Council impact the global decisions that this organization will make, especially in critical issues like climate change and conflict resolution?
Thank you. And this is the part that I truly find the most interesting. Within the continent of Africa, we have repeatedly had great meltdowns as touching conflicts. I mean, you saw the conflicts between Ethiopia and the Tigray region. Of course, you also see that between Ethiopia and Eritrea. We've had repeated conflict issues within the continent, both those who are intra and those who are inter. And you see that every time the international bodies attempt to weigh in, what happens is there's a deeper meltdown. Because a lot of times, those who are taking the decisions as to how our conflicts should be resolved, they don't understand our intricacies. And because it is still stemming from that colonial mindset, oh, well, we were the ones who brought them together. We seem to have control over specific regions and resources. We can take their decision. It's not working anymore. It is time for Africans to pioneer the reins of how conflict is resolved. A lot of times, Africa is disproportionately affected by all the different things going on with climate change. But because we're not inside the room deciding how we truly want to attack these decisions, then a decision is taken by China, Russia, and France, and we have to, for want of a better word, play into whatever it is decided for us. So I think now more than ever, that exclusion is causing Africa to not really enjoy the benefit of what the UNSC stands for. Now more than ever, if a country is representing the interest of the whole world, every region should truly be able to benefit from the outcomes of their decisions, the outcomes of their meetings, the outcomes of their agreements. And the only way is to have accurate representation of each region, of each continent, so that these decisions can truly trickle down in terms of impact to each of the continents.
Many African leaders are calling for the reform of this institution, this international organization. If you remember, the late president of the Republic of Zimbabwe, Robert Gabriel Mugabe, had been calling for the reform of this institution, and even our Prime Minister Dr. Abiy Ahmed, has been calling for the same thing, the reform. And what specific reforms do you think are necessary for the United Nations Security Council to reflect contemporary global realities more accurately than it is now?
Thank you. So currently we have 15 members, 5 permanent members, 10 rotating members. Within those 10 rotating members, we have 2 African nations that are being rotated, and their seats would expire sometime in 2025. If we truly want to see a United Nations security that captures the interests of the entire globe like they represent, we need to begin to see this kind of reforms. Number one, we need to see an expansion of the permanent seats for Africa and other underrepresented regions. Because Africa is not the only underrepresented region, but we need to see an expanded number of permanent seats for these particular regions. But also, we also need to see not just the expansion of the permanent seats, but we also need to see veto power being given to these other expanded permanent seats. Otherwise, let's abolish veto power. If this veto power cannot be given to all the other regions who are coming on the seat, let's abolish veto power so that we will know it's just the vote of all the permanent members, and then this can begin to trickle down as touching impact. Then the other reforms I think we need to see is we need to see an increased transparency and open debate as touching how these decisions are made. An organization that represents the interests of the whole world their processes and their methods should be transparent so that it is seen as though those who are in the room understand the need and the pain of all the other people and is captured in their decision making. So I think predominantly these three reforms will be great to see: expanding the number of permanent seats to capture Africa and other underrepresented regions. Number two, giving these permanent regions also veto power or abolishing the veto power completely, right? And then number three, increasing transparency and open debate as to how their decisions are truly made as a body.
So what is the legitimacy of this organization, this United Nations Security Council for Africa?
Thank you. I like that conversations like this are coming out. For the longest time, like you said, a lot of African governments have spoken up about reforms at the United Nations Security. And for the longest time, it probably feels as though it's been hitting brick walls. But recently, I realized that now they are paying attention. But you see, what is very critical about this conversation now is that there's a crop of young Africans that are arising and will not take no for an answer. There's a crop of young Africans that are arising who will make decisions that would pioneer the growth of Africa, irrespective of any organization. There's a crop of Africans that are rising that will decide we want to be able to decide our fate by ourselves. And so the better the United Nations and the United Nations Security begin to pay attention to this cry for reforms, truly the more stable and relevant the organization will continue to be in Africa and other regions. Well, because we are speaking for Africa, for us to see the relevance of this particular body in Africa, Africans' views, Africans' opinions, Africans' cry for representation must be adhered to, so that we don't end up having a crop of young Africans who will arise and say, we don't need to be a part of this body if they cannot represent what we truly want to see as touching change. We know that's not where we want to get to, so it's important that these conversations are adhered to and reforms begin to truly find expression in the different bodies where necessary. I know that the United Nations Security is one of the reforms we're crying out for. There's many more that the global north needs to begin to pay attention to, the global south needs to begin to pay attention to as touching these demands that us as Africans are asking for.
Thank you, Ibe. And our aspiration is, as you know, to get a meaningful representation, not this fake representation. And
yes.
African Union has a great responsibility in this regard, as you know. And my question is, what strategies could be employed to advocate these aspirations at the level of organizations like African Union?
The African Union for a long time has been pioneering the different conversations around uniting Africa so that Africa can speak with one voice. I find that one of the reasons why it feels as though majority of the bodies, perhaps including the United Nations Security, hasn't taken very seriously the cry for Africans' deep representation is perhaps because we still do not necessarily speak one voice. There's still a lot of division amongst us Africans as touching what we want and what we want to see, even though the intents of our hearts may be the same, but we have not been able to come to that rallying point of unity as touching what we want to see. So I believe that now more than ever, the efforts of the African Union must be deepened as touching proper governance within its member states, so that all of us can achieve one voice, one purpose, one goal. Once we have achieved that, by the help of the African Union and other governing bodies that speak to what we're trying to achieve as Pan-Africans, then we can go together as a collective with stronger voice, stronger demands to governing bodies like the UN or the United Nations Security and all the other bodies where we're seeking active reforms where Africa is permanently or properly represented. So I'm saying that the AU now more than ever needs to galvanize their effort to create lasting unity and oneness in terms of what we want to see represented amongst us as Africans in these times.
Yeah, sure. And don't you think that this decision, United Nations Security Council decision, weakening the international diplomacy, that ignoring a continent, which is the largest continent, and what do you say on these?
Well, I would say that Africa may be the largest continent as a continent, but if you look closely, China also have the numbers that Africa has, just slightly higher. India has the numbers that Africa has, slightly higher. So in terms of numbers, maybe we're not the largest in terms of regional representation. China is a bit larger, India is a bit larger, but we're within the same bracket. Africa 1.4 projected to be about 2 billion in the next 30 years. So that means it's a large block. And if the other regions such as China represents Asia, they are represented. India maybe is one way connected, and maybe I doubt, but ignoring Africa repeatedly is the world trying to say we do not recognize the potential that Africa carries. And that's an anomaly because Africa is the youngest population or is the largest population with the youngest demography. That means the pioneering the frontiers of the future lies within looking into Africa in every ramification. So continual ignorance of the different reforms that Africans are crying for is a ticking time bomb. Because now the whole world is looking into Africa. China, America, UK, everyone is looking into Africa. So to continue to ignore the cry of the people who everyone is literally paying attention to is a ticking time bomb. So I do want to say that every singular international body associated with making decisions must now more than ever think about proper partnership and collaboration with Africa. This time around, seeing Africa as a co-player or as an equal player will go a long way to deepen our diplomatic ties. It will go a long way to strengthen the trust between us as nations, as continents, so that we can truly drive effective change and effective growth of all our individual nations and the world at large.
Great. And let us also talk about the decision that is made by United States. Could you elaborate on the rationale behind the US's decision to support 2 African countries as a permanent members of the United Nations Security Council without veto power?
I see that the US is trying to make an effort to weigh in on the conversations. While we may applaud the effort so far, it's still not enough. What we want is not just permanent representation, we also want the veto power. If US, UK, China, Russia, and France can have veto power, the only way Africa should sit in that room, on that table, is with the same equal veto power. For God's sakes, this is not 1940s. We are still not under colonialism. If the world truly says we are not being colonized, what then is happening at decision-making rooms where it is obvious, it is very obvious that you're saying, Africa, yeah, you can be at the table, but we don't want you to bite out of the bone that is being chewed. I feel like that's degradation at the highest level in the 21st century. America is quote unquote a nation of liberality. For once, let the decision be liberal, let it be fair, let it be equitable. And like I said earlier in my conversation, for how long will Africans keep demanding what should be and should have been for the longest time? What should be and what should have been? The fact that we're even sitting on the table and asking to be a part of this room in itself is disrespectful. And then for them to say, okay, we can bring you in, but no veto power is another level of disrespectful. And I hope that African leaders are paying attention to this tide of conversations, because what I begin to see, it feels as though some African nations are interested, others don't care, and everybody is minding their business. For how long will we continue to go about our different ways, not recognizing that there's something here we must pay attention to? Do you know, my dear brother, and for all Africans who are listening, our quest for equal right on that table with veto power is not just a decision for now, it's for the next generation. That a new generation of Africans are going to emerge, and they will wonder how come 400 years ago we were colonized, and up until several years later we are still suffering the effects of this colonialism. For how long? So as African leaders, now more than ever, I know you have the responsibility to run your nations, to indeed prosper, to run your nations to grow, to run your citizens to truly enjoy the dividends of your office. But please pay attention to the seeds you are going to sow for the next generation. So that when you are asked, what did you do in your time? You obviously have something to contribute to the seed you sowed or the seed you planted for the future or for the next generation. We need equitable rights with veto power on that table, or else let the veto power be abolished so that all of us have permanent seats and we are there. Do you see what I'm saying? Now more than ever, all African nations should rally together and say, this is not just a matter of now, it's a matter of our future. In the same way, the men who started this move of liberation, the Kwame Nkrumah, the Julius Nyerere, who fought so that we can have independence. All of us are enjoying the dividends of that independence because a few leaders decided to live their personal lives and fight for the independence. We now have the independence. We must move from independence now, or liberation, what you may call it now, to begin to think about how we can plant a seed that will speak for a transformed Africa in the future. And decisions like this are critical to making sure it happens.
One of African women described this situation as inviting someone to the dining room, but not to allow eating the dine. And you have explained very well. Thank you. That's why we are inviting people from all over the world, even African who are living in different parts of the world and even in Africa. Thank you very much for your explanation, Ibe. And as we are concluding, let me raise this question. Some writers and activists and different concerned people are raising that what the United Nations Security Council is doing is a kind of demonizing the continent as the entire continent, undermining the effort of the continent. They want us if they want us, and they ignore us if they don't want us. And how do you describe this situation? And you said, how long we wait this suppression, this kind of neocolonialism? How long you have already asked it? And what is your insight on this?
Anybody who treats you repeatedly in a demeaning way does so because you have allowed them to do so for the longest time. And I'll say this 3 times. Anybody who treats you disrespectfully or in a demeaning way consistently, it's because you have allowed them to do so. The day comes, or a 3rd time, anybody who treats you disrespectfully and in a demeaning way consistently is because you have allowed them to. A day comes in the life of a man when he rises up and says, I will no longer tolerate this sort of treatment or disrespect from whoever it is, and will put systems in place to truly avoid a repetition of what they have endured. Let's bring it down to Africa as a context. The South has continued to do this to Africa since inception. One of the reasons why they have continually succeeded is because of the division amongst us. Divided, we are too small to compete. That is why if a Paul Kagame speaks, it is easy for him to come under fire. If a Museveni speaks, it is easy for him to come under fire. If an Abiy Ahmed speaks, it's easy for him to come under fire. Why? Because he's speaking as an individual. So if an individual against the conglomerate of the 5 member states who have veto power, you can imagine that his strength is small to fight that conglomerate. And why do I say so? Then they come with counter policies that attempt to stifle his reign and begin to cause all kinds of things that make his reign or his rulership or his regime very unbearable for his people. They have a system of getting at anyone who truly wants to challenge the status quo. So what does this mean? As a matter of fact, as African leaders, you can see that the trend is obvious. The moment one person attempts to speak against injustice and corruption from each of these bodies, he comes under serious attack internally and externally. It is a system that has been perpetrated by both colonialism and neocolonialism. And it's not going to end until all African leaders say, together we are strong and we cannot be refused by no matter how big they are. Because guess what? Africa has the size, Africa has the resources, Africa has the ingenuity, Africa has the labor power to be able to withstand any nation in this world. But how well do we see ourselves as one? This, my dear brother and brothers of Africa all over the world, this is what we need to begin to pay attention to. Anyone who has consistently disrespected us, they know that they can make us divided, and once they divide us, they can conquer us one after the other. That's what happened with Berlin in Berlin Conference, and that's what they have continued to perpetrate. For how long would we watch? For how long would we watch? So I'm not going to say, oh, why is US treating us this way? Why is China? Africans have allowed them. Let's come together and speak with a stronger voice, one united, so that if a UN security turns this way, Africa is speaking one voice. They turn this way, Africa is speaking one voice. They turn that way, everywhere is one voice. They can't run anymore. They will be compelled to make that change. If I am speaking with such passion, a Dr. Arikana is speaking with such passion, a Julius Malema is speaking with such passion, and then they go to the president is unconcerned. How do you think the change is going to happen? So it feels as though the activists are actively asking for a change and reform, but the presidents don't seem like they care. Do you see what I'm saying? So at this point, there must be a union between what the activists believe, what the reformers believe, and what the presidents of each of the nations in Africa believe. Once we have that synergy, then we go to the table with one formidable voice, with one formidable vision, with a clear goal, and it cannot be refused.
Thank you very much for this explanation. Divided, we are too small to fit, you said, which is a great explanation. And finally, if you have any message to my audience, you are welcome, as my time is running.
Thank you very much. Africans, we have said it again and again, Africa is rising, it's no longer news. Africa is emerging, and it's emerging powerfully. There is a burst of zeal, there's a burst of zeal in the heart of Africans scattered across the world. Those within Africa and those in the diaspora. There's a hunger to see the Africa that they desire. There's a hunger to see the Africa that they see. And everywhere, men and women are rising up with answers in their hands to build that Africa. Wherever you are, and you carry a seed that looks like a solution to this continent, how be it, no matter how small, now is the time to lead the change. As much as we're demanding change from our government, demanding change from our leaders, demanding change from regional and continental bodies, you and I are the leaders that we see. You and I are the leaders we have control over. Lead the change in your respective sphere of influence, no matter how small. Start now. As you begin to make a difference, if 1.4 billion of us individually decide to make a difference, after a while, this continent will be filled with differences that each and every one of us has continued to make, and then it will be indeed the envy of all the nations of the world. Thank you very much.
Great. Just Omomo Ibe, President of the Association of African Startups. Thank you very much for your insight and for your time as well.
Thank you very much for having me. God bless you.
Dear viewers, this is all about our discussion with Just Omomo Ibe, and I'm sure you have got some important insights from this discussion. And until next edition, goodbye.